and deserving that would have been. Len has been involved with the Lakefield Historical Society since its beginning, since the early formation, and continuing with the help of his lifelong friend Bob Deladon and Fred Charlton, as well as Doug Kennedy and others, such as Don Hurl and so on. They prepared and published our beautiful book, which we get a lot of glory and acclaim from to this day, and it's just a wonderful history book, From Nelson Falls to Lakefield. I guess, really, certainly is active. Only Doug and Len are the only ones who are active today, and the rest have passed on and are writing books elsewhere. It is therefore with great pleasure that I present my friend, Len Wingate, with the plaque proclaiming our appreciation and granting Len the distinction of being an honorary life member of the Lakefield Historical Society. Thank you. Len, would you care to say anything? He's the best.
Could I just take the liberty of reading what this says? It says, "The Lakefield Historical Society hereby honors Len Wingate for his many years of dedication and commitment to this society, September 30th, 2010. And there you can hang that on your wall forever.
I will do that. I wish to thank you all for coming and appreciate this plaque. Sorry I can't seem to talk very well anyway, so, okay?
That's one.
We decided at the outset of our new executive that we would try to make our meetings short, interesting, and fun. Well, we've already had some fun, and thank you, Neil, for a wonderful introduction. I also have the opportunity, I have a captive audience, and there's someone else in the society that deserves a little bit of, well, more appreciation than she's ever received before, and it's certainly well earned. We were thinking about computerizing all our records and so on, and we discovered that we already have a computer, and her name is Sheila Garrett. And Sheila has done a magnificent job of putting things together on behalf of this society. She has worked tirelessly. Whenever someone comes up and says, you know, I wonder if you have any information about so-and-so. And of course, we go to the computer and say, Sheila, do you have any information? Well, yes, it's down here in this 13th book, right down here, and I'll get it out for you. And she does. During the recent walk that was conducted in the village, we supplied pictures and information to nearly everyone who participated as being members who were giving talks and so on. And that was just a small part of what she was involved in doing. Somebody phoned her one day and said that they had a picture of a beautiful scene in Stony Lake, taken back in 54 or something. And they noticed that in the background was a picture of a boat towing some kind of a barge or something. Do you know anything about that, Sheila? So Sheila knew what it was all about. And next thing you know, she compiled a history of the Lakefield, what did they call it? The old days, the Nephilim. She did a complete history of it and so on, and sent it to this gentleman. And not only that, but she went and took it to him, I think, and he has a studio up around Gooderham somewhere. So Sheila went up and presented this to him. Well, he was overwhelmed. He just couldn't believe what one little inquiry would do. And so he presented her with a magnificent and large picture in which the Waukeeta and a barge, or two barges, were coming down Stony Lake. And it is the most beautiful picture. This is what Sheila brought to our last meeting to show us the appreciation that she received from this gentleman. The name I'm not sure of. And we almost every day get a request from someone requesting information about something. So Sheila, thank you for being such an ideal help, wonderful help to the Lakefield Historical Society. And I have a little presentation. Would you like to come up and accept this on behalf of our Not willingly. Sheila, on behalf of our group, I have to present to you a lovely little item here, and it's dated today, and it says, "To Sheila Garrett, in recognition of her outstanding service to the Lakefield Historical Society." And I'd like you to take that home and enjoy it forever.
Thank you very much. I much prefer working behind the scenes than being up here. Thank you.
There's a box that goes with that, Sheila, if you'd like to take that home with you. Where were we? I have a little card here somewhere. Where did I put my card? I lost it. Trouble again. Yeah.
Sounds like Igor. Your historical society operates on money. And your membership, we appreciate that, and are just so pleased with the turnout this evening. We don't get this many as a Tupperware party. One of the things we have for a fundraiser, this year we're having an Oktoberfest coffee house evening at the Lakefield Legion. We're going to have entertainment and we're going to have fun. It's going to be fun, 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 and we're going to have local and area entertainment, top class, you know. And the tickets it starts at 7:30 p.m. at the Lakefield Legion upstairs. If you haven't been there recently, it's a beautiful facility. They've really dressed it up, brightened it up. It's a non-smoking facility, and it's there will be a casual affair with sit-around recreational chairs at tables. And it's Friday, October the 22nd at 7:30 p.m. And we just love to have a good crowd there. And get a few friends, make up a party, come and have some fun. We guarantee you that Derry says that he'll personally refund anybody's money that doesn't have a good time. The cost is $10 per ticket. And they're for sale. They're for sale over here. They're selling fast. But if you want to have fun, anybody that doesn't want to have fun, I advise you to stay right away. We don't need pressure. Thank you.
So, we'll get on with our meeting. We're going to keep our business portion of the meetings as short as possible. All our day-to-day operating business is going to be conducted at our executive meetings, which, as I said, are held every second Monday of the month. And all are welcome. They're held at our house. And we'd love you to come over not only to participate in the meeting itself, but to see what kind of a wonderful job Sheila has done organizing all the assets that you shareholders own. So please drop over. Now, we have our guest speakers with us tonight, and we've put them off so long that Mike has left. No, he's still here. So, without further ado, we'd like Mike and his lovely wife to step forward, and the mics and speakers are yours, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
Lawson's going to be quite an act to follow. Didn't count on him, we should have included more jokes.
Made a lot of money on it.
Take that to the bank. While Mike's getting organized, we started to write a script because me having a certificate from Ireland from kissing the Blarney Stone, we thought we'd better put some controls in here. But it ended up being like the Great Canadian Novel. So we canned that, and we're just going to, we've got things to remind us, we're just going to do it freehand.
Can everyone hear it all?
Mike's just getting the mic right there. So Michael's going to start.
Use the mic, please.
Yeah, well, we're always.
I think it's on. It's okay. You often wonder how you should run one of these meetings, you know, in this position. And I guess I'll get into the, starting from when I left England and how I came to do that. We'll start partway through and ask if there's any questions. I think that may be the easiest way. I was born in Croydon, Surrey, England. I was the second eldest of a family of 6, eventually a family of 6. The home was very, very near to the Croydon airport. In fact, if I went to the end of the street, I could actually see the airport. And that has quite a bearing on what happened to my life shortly after. But just as a basic rundown of my family and grandparents and such, my grandparents on my mother's side were May and Tom Martin, and she was a Romany gypsy, and he was a Cockney, born within the sound of Bow Bells. They had, as their family, they had a greengrocery business, primarily provisioning chips. And they had a donkey, and which carried their stuff around town. And then they were in the row houses, and at nighttime, which is sort of interesting, the donkey was taken right through the house, passageway, kitchen, living room, into the backyard, and that's where it stayed until the next day. Being a Romany gypsy, my grandmother was extremely superstitious, and she nearly went bonkers, shall I say, with cross knives, looking at the moon through glass, crossing on stairs, and of course, as a young kid, I made every effort I could to race upstairs when she was coming down, cross knives at the dining room table. So, you know, that's how life was in those days. My grandfather, he
after the greengrocery business, he ended up in a Daimler car hire business as a driver. And primarily his clients were all wealthy racing enthusiasts, and he took them to the racetracks. And the story goes that somehow or another he had spent or gambled away some of the rent money for the car, and just by chance he picked up a florin or 2 florins or so on the ground, and he bet on a triactor, which some of you may know what it is. I don't, because I've never been to gamble at all on the races. And he won that, and he vowed not to gamble again, which he didn't do until later years. He played the footballs. And but it was interesting what he did with the money, because the first thing was to buy a friend an artificial leg, and the second thing was to buy himself a pub license to operate a pub, and which he did for the rest of his life until he retired. I used to spend some of my summers there, most of the summers, I say, from about 5 or 6 up to when the war was declared. And that again is probably could be put into a whole other story, because it was more fun living in Suffolk, in a small village, and living in a pub than you can imagine. When the war came along, my mother said that none of her children were going to leave her during the war years. There was an unidentified plane, apparently. Some of this is what I was told as a kid. Seen off the cliffs of Dover. The air raid sirens went off, and within 2 days I was shipped out. And that's where somebody made up the introduction for this and said, "No time to wave goodbye." Who was that?
No, that's the book.
No, but I said who?
Oh, well,
Patricia.
no,
Patricia.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I do not know where my copy is, but I do know where 2 I can get.
We are going to talk about your father's,
Oh,
he missed his father's parents.
my
Another
father,
funny couple.
Edwin and Mrs. Dean were my dad's parents, and he was a bit of a tyrant, an artist and a decorator. When income tax came into England, he refused to pay. 11 years later, they knocked at the door, took his best year out of 11, multiplied by 11, and broke it. It was as simple as that. So, nothing would do, but my grandmother was taken in laundry to keep the family alive, fortunately, at that time. Also, at that time, and you'll see a photograph over on the table there of a young man in early flying gear.
Just a minute, you didn't talk about him painting. She wanted to sell a painting.
Oh yeah, I missed that.
That's one of his
She
paintings back
wanted,
on the
she
table
wanted,
there.
she wanted to sell a painting or 2, at which his reply was, "If you sell any or take any out of the house, I'll burn the rest." And he had hundreds of these things. He had a conservatory down the fence, and which he used as his shop and his painting shop. And I can remember them being lined up along the wall, on the floor, paintings of all shapes and sizes and subjects. My dad was very interested in airplanes and spent a lot of time at the Croydon Airport. And you'll see in the background in their photograph are some of the old biplanes and triplanes that used to fly back and forth to Europe. And it was interesting because apparently at that time when the plane landed, they raised the flag. It was quite an achievement to get from England to Europe and Europe back to England. And, but Bristol Aircraft made an offer to my dad for him to serve an apprentice as a pilot. And old grumpy Edwin said, no way. Decorating is our trade, and that's what you're going to do. And unfortunately, I think my dad spent most of his life in regret of that happening. In all fairness, he may not have lasted that long, but he didn't. He did use some of his aircraft skills during the war. As I started to mention that the sirens went off, and 2 days later I was gone. I was 9 years old, and I stayed away from home for 6 years, and I didn't see any of my siblings or my dad, but I did see my mother once every 2 weeks. And I'll fill you in a little bit more of that later on.
Mike's going to take a little break just while, I don't know where this poem turned up, but it's one I've had on the bulletin board ever since I saw it. And I think it was something to do with the group in Peterborough with the Bernardo children. And it's called The Evacuee. With a label on my blazer and a suitcase in my hand, my gas mask slung across me, very frightened here I stand. I can hear some children crying, others laughing, but not I, for I'm waiting very quietly and feeling small and shy. We've traveled on a chugging train, we've traveled on a bus, and now we're lined up in the street and told we mustn't fuss. And the teachers study names on lists and knock upon each door. Did you say you'd have one little girl? And could you have one more? I haven't got a sister, and I haven't got a brother, and that is why they take me out, the first of any other. But at tea time, Billy Brown's still there. The twins are at his side. They've got very dirty faces where the tears have streaked and dried. And I have the strangest feeling, when I'm grown up, I'll remember this year of 1939 and the sad month of September. And I'll think about the nighttime when my mom was far away and hope that other children never know so long a day. And that was, I suppose, the experience of thousands of children. But it was all done under good intentions. And many of them went back home. There were actually 2 boys first placed with Mike, but one went back home. So he's going to tell you about his time in the country.
We didn't really go that far in many cases. Some did, some came to Canada, evacuees, and we were shipped out from Croydon on a bus. We ended up in East Grinstead, which is roughly halfway between Croydon and Brighton, give or take a few. We were unloaded and went into a church hall, and as the poem said, we just stood there waiting to be picked up or collected or approved or disapproved. There were a lot of stories about that at a later date. A middle-aged couple, I'll say middle-aged, say 40 years, they were childless, and they came along and they took myself and another boy. We lived on a road called Green Hedges Avenue, and just to go back a second, the railway in East Grinstead had east and west and north and south, and we were right on the road next to the railroad tracks. So, you know, if anything was going to happen during the war, the railroad tracks were going to get it well and truly, and the railroad stations. They were the first things they went after. East Grinstead was, I can't really tell you the population then, but it wasn't really big. It was a farming community, and putting these things down always make you remember funny little quirky things. I can always remember the train coming in from the coast, from the east, and they came in on the top line, and the bottom line would go to London, and they had flopped down chutes on the side of the stairways, which they said all the boxes of ice fish down from the east coast, coming from the east coast, switching to the London line, and that's how they got the fish so quickly to London. I mean, it was just a matter of hours. As a whole, I think evacuees were treated reasonably well, but when talking to Ben Wicks, when he was on a phone-in show, I came to hear of problems that some evacuees had, and it really wasn't that nice. They were taken for their food coupons, they were abused, it was quite endless. On some places they became virtual slaves on farms, which wasn't fair at all. For me, the Eagles, Mr. and Mrs. Eagle, were extremely nice people, and they fed me well, and he had access to some extra food through his job, and I spent most of my time roaming around the country. I knew every pond, every stream, everything that you could think of that a kid would enjoy doing in the countryside. East Grinstead had a fairly good hospital, and the Canadians built a burn wing there to look after the pilots that came down and were badly burned. These pilots didn't particularly want to walk in town because they weren't always covered with bandages, but their faces were usually not a very nice sight. And a lot of people didn't like to look at them. But being a kid, it didn't matter much to me or us, because we used to roam around together, and we'd walk with them by the hour and talk with them as they were roaming the woods too. And when I think about it, it was a pretty sad time for those guys and for us, but we did, to some degree, help them to get back into the regular world. They were all taking skin grafting, primarily. That's what the burn wing was all about, which the Canadians built. Being a small town, we certainly had our fair share of war. One thing I never really understood, why the village was virtually ringed with anti-tank defenses, which I think to this day was the forerunner of steel scaffolding. And they were all put to lean out from the village to start tanks would come to them and would roll over. That was basically the theory anyhow. On the way to school one day, it was typical British foggy, drizzly morning, and I heard this airplane. It was around 9 o'clock, I guess. And this plane came out of the fog, and there was a laundry there with a fairly tall steel chimney. And this plane flew around the chimney, and it had a swastika on the side of the plane. I could see the pilot as clear as could be, even though it was a little foggy, and he was looking here and there. and he turned into the fog and flew up the main street and dropped his bombs right in the middle of town on the movie theater. If it had been after midday, it would have been virtually full of people. But at that point, there was nobody in there. So nobody was actually killed by that incident. It was old hat when the siren went to go into the shelters, and you could hear the planes dogfighting, you could hear the shrapnel falling on the roofs, and when we came out, there'd be cannon holes in the walls of the auditorium in the school. I mean, and yet, it seems as if we just went on as if it was of no consequence. I can remember we were playing cricket just south of East Grinstead at a place called Felbridge, and I think that was the first time I'd ever seen a jet plane. I think it was a Sabre. If you got somebody in the Air Force, you might know what it was, or if that's correct. And we also had the doodlebugs flying in from Germany at that time. And doodlebugs ran until they quit and you took cover. In this case, what they would do, they would fly alongside a doodlebug, put their wing under it, and they would turn one way, and the doodlebug would go into the ground the other. They attempted to do this in the fields away from towns. But this fella came out of the blue, and we were playing cricket quite happily, and he tipped it up. We ran like hell. It fell in it split a huge chestnut tree, virtually blew it out of the ground. We just got up and went on playing cricket. It really didn't matter that much. It was just a hell of a big bang, and away we went.
Plane ended up.
Sorry?
Plane ended up flying between two houses.
Oh, yeah, and another one was when a German plane obviously had been in a dogfight, and the pilot had been killed and was still in the plane, and the plane just went on, slowly coming down, went between two houses, nipped off each end of the wings, and crashed in the fields behind it. But this stuff was all the time. I mean, it happened constantly. In the Rome in the country, we, in another village just a little to the south of us, there was a silica sand mine, or quarry, shall I say. And there was a huge steel structure there with cables and a loading tower. What they used to do, they used to bucket the silicone up into the building, and the trucks would go underneath, and they would load them just out of the chutes straight into the back of the trucks. Now this sand, or silica sand, was, this quarry was where all the glass for the Crystal Palace was made. And by then it was derelict, but it was a great place for kids to climb and play. And I don't think my mother ever knew this, but we used to climb the tower and go down the cables across the quarry, like shinny down the cables. I think she would have died a death quicker than bombing if she'd known that.
Want me to do a little bit?
Yeah.
This is, excuse me, this will just be hearsay because I wasn't in England with Mike. His dad worked at his business as a decorator, and he did bomb damage work. And I remember Mike saying that he started out the war being a decorator and ended up being an electrician, a plumber, a plasterer, because his was the last job in line. And he had a firm with about 9 men that he was responsible to keep working. So he'd say, oh heck, we might as well do the wiring, they're never gonna come. And it ended up, and this was a great way for Mike to learn all the different trades. Mike's mom she had a child born, don't ask how. I don't know, I don't think she knew. She had a child born every 5 years for 20 years. And then after that, she had 1 in 2 years and 1 in 2 years. And she said, I was certainly old enough to know better. But, you know, it was wartime. And while Frank was out at night on the home guard, he worked full time, and then he worked nights on the home guard, out patrolling, putting out fires. And he'd come home around 5 o'clock in the morning, and you know the story. It's too late to go back to sleep, and too early to... So she said, I had 2 more children. Anyway, part of their, Mom and I were like sisters. We worked together. She worked for us at the Marina for over 25 years. And they did follow Mike out from England. He came 1951, they came 1957. And Mike will tell you a little bit about that. But their life was the same as Mike. You carried on even though the bombs are bursting around you. They had to install this horrible thing called a Morrison cage in the dining room. And so every time the siren went off, if you didn't have time to make it to the shelter, you just dove for the Morrison cage. And actually they used the top of it as their dining room table. And for many nights, you slept in the Morrison cage. Well, with 4 young children at home, that was pretty hectic. And as Mom said, 2 things. Winston Churchill, the women were always in their print dresses. And I guess Churchill realized that they were living a pretty hectic life. So he invented this thing called a siren suit. And you just jumped into it and zipped it up. And didn't matter what you were wearing, you could run out of the house to the shelter. And Mom said, I only lost it once when Graham, who was the second youngest, sleeping, of course, in a laundry basket, she ran down the stairs with him during the siren, and the basket got caught, and she said, I just lost it. But that's the only time she remembers that happening during the war. Things were very, very hard for the British as the war went on. They had very little good food. Mom used to tell me about how they would be so creative with anything, wandering, going out into the country. As Mike said, despite everything she went through, Mike's mom visited Mike every other Saturday for 6 years. I don't know how she managed it. She took the Green Line bus down, and he said they'd go into town, have a cup of tea. She'd bring him because he didn't know any of his brothers and sisters. And but Mike's dad said once, being a decorator, he used a lot of wallpaper paste, and they were told it was going off the market. Forget about your wallpaper, it's wartime. And within a short time, they brought out imitation potatoes. And Dad says, well, that's where our wallpaper paste went. And the neighborhood, everyone was very close, because everybody was in this together. And Mom said every so often, the women would get ambitious, and they'd say, do you have an egg? I have some milk. Do you have some flour? And between them, they'd put together a cake. And then they'd say, this was during the Battle of Britain, which went on, I can't recall if it was 50 or 65 nights of bombing. And so they'd say, oh darn, I hope Jerry's late tonight because we just got that cake in the oven. And inevitably, if the siren went, you were to run for the shelter. Mike's dad was constantly working. And during all of this, he still found time to renovate this house they were living in. And he had just finished. Mom said they had the velvet drapes up in the living room. He was a great one for going to antique sales. So he'd gone off to an antique sale and come back with this Lalique glass hanging lamp for the front hall. The bathroom had just been finished, and that had taken about 3 years of when I get time. And that night, Mike's mom said, I'm not going to the shelter. I've had it. I cannot get these kids together and go one more night. And she told her neighbor across the street. And the neighbor said, they called her Doll. Doll, I have a bad feeling. We're all going to the shelter tonight. And that night, as you can imagine, the house was bombed. And Mike and Mom said, the whole top was gone off the house. The bathroom was nowhere to be found. They never saw. There were things that survived in the front hall, both sides, but the Lalit glass fixture was gone, and they never found one piece of broken glass from it. And so that was, they could have been all dead. And there had been a landmine that had been dropped across the road, and it just blew the top right off the house and the rest of it. They had been, even though this was a hobby of Mike's dad, as well as he managed to put together an airplane in the backyard out of spare parts. He had already found the next house he was going to decorate. And this one they had got a rather good buy on, because it had been, the story went that the house had been for sale forever because the previous owner had hanged himself in the front hall stairwell and nobody would buy it. And Dad said, that's nonsense, we're buying it. But they did, the kids were, you know, of course the kids eventually heard about this, and they were always a bit nervous of the house. And Mike's parents, we should have brought, what do we call them, Svengali. They have a painting. My kids were scared of it too. We ended up owning it. And it's just a man's head, and it's probably cut out of a much larger painting. But Mike's mom had that at the bottom of the stairs, and she didn't realize the kids were terrified of it. And Mike said, I can always remember as a little boy running down the stairs and swinging around the banister with my eyes shut so I wouldn't have to look at Svengali. His father, of course everybody ran out of gas. Everybody's cars were full of raising rabbits for food, and we had that on our street in Peterborough. A car up on blocks, and they used it to put rabbits in it. We had rationing too, but nothing like them. And one day he was biking to one of his jobs, and there was a doodlebug flying overhead, and he knew the first thing to do, he had dived for the ditch. So he immediately dove into a ditch. And when he crawled out of the ditch to get his bike, there was a shoe with a foot in it. But he never saw the rest of the person that had gone. Mike's sister Phil always was saying, oh, I'm too nervous, I could never do that, I'm too nervous. She was 5 years older than him. And at about 15 or 16, she was off working on a farm. She was driving jeeps, driving tractors, and spent the war working as hard as any man. And despite how bad things were, Mike had quite a large family with lots of relatives, lots of cousins, aunts, and uncles, and not one person in his family died during the war. No one was even injured, even though, I don't know, was Rue a relative or a friend? I don't know, but he was a guy that was accident prone. He was part of Mike's dad's crew, but he was what they called comic relief, because almost every day Rue did something stupid, which should have killed him, but it never did. And so when they sent Rue to Egypt, everybody said, well, that's the end of him. Well, he managed to fall down a sand dune into a hole where there was a dead camel, and I think they had to give him about 27 shots for that. But Rue came back from the war smiling and ready to go back to work. So then all of a sudden, actually, we didn't put anything about this, but the reason Mike came to Canada, really, was that he wanted to, he was engaged at the time, to a lovely girl, and he was thinking about setting up housekeeping.
I can show you a photograph of her.
Oh, yeah. In a bathing suit. And he was thinking of his future, and he was getting to be 20, 21, and in England, most guys were married by that time. And he asked his father if they could start up a branch of their business about 30 miles away. And his father, and I think maybe one of my sons can relate to this, was just over 50, and said, he said, like, he was exhausted from the war. And he said, no, Mike, I'm not interested in helping you set up a branch of our business 30 miles away. So as it turned out, Mike went 3,000 miles away.
You might as well go far enough that you can't get called
Hold it right
back
up, Mike. You gotta hold
in
that.
5 minutes, you know, which I was always a little nervous of. One of the reasons that we were working on Old Bond Street, and I used to wander across to Regent Street during lunch hour, and other than we were up on the 3rd floor, other than watching the ladies of the night work on the opposite side of the street, which was quite interesting. But anyhow, during going across the small streets to get to Regent, I passed the Canadian Immigration Office and had a chat, went in there, just out of curiosity to some degree, and spoke to the fella there, and he said, you know, we live close. Why don't you come over and see me one evening, have a cup of tea? So I wandered over one evening, and the first thing he said to me was, the streets are not paved with gold, and you might come unstuck a few times, but if you try hard enough, you'll make it. And I think that's pretty close to how my life has been, my life with Aileen has been. There's been the odd time when you think, will I make it? Is it worth it? But yes, it definitely has been. The work we did in London was pretty, we actually were working for a woman interior decorator, and she had a lot of good work. There was no two ways about it. We did George Bernard Shaw's apartment up a couple of times, Lord and Lady Wimborne's, and this is gentry for you. He would bring us a cup of tea at 10 o'clock in the morning, and we'd hear him coming along the passage, slopping his slippers. He and she were the nicest people on this earth. We did Frank Sinatra's apartment up once. This is where most of our work was after the war. And of course that included decorating and bomb damage repairs, pulling down ceilings. And we had a plasterer working for us who was somewhat of a genius. And when you go into some of these old buildings and see the beautiful cornices with all the apples and pears in the plaster work, he would do that. That's what we were replacing. And it is an extremely skilled job. There is no two ways about it.
Tell them how he did it. He had to make the molds.
Yeah, it was all made in, the cornices were run with a recess in it all the way around. And then he would cast in plaster he would originally make a plaster mold, take a plaster model, take a gelatin mold off of it, and then he would cast the plaster sections in the gelatin mold, and they would be stuck into the corners in this space that was left when we were on it. But they did, in the bomb damage repairs, in the houses that had that type of plasterwork, they replaced it.
You're going to Canada.
I'm getting there. Anyhow, one of the reasons, I think at that point I was sort of considering where I would like to go. For some reason, Australia didn't appeal to me. Tasmania was a maybe, and then Canada was on the same list. And I think what really swung me to come this way was the amount of fresh water there was in Canada. Because unbeknownst to me, I couldn't tell you why exactly, I guess I'd figured it out in my mind, but wasn't saying this is the specific reason. But I figured that any country that had more fresh water than any other was on the plus side. And I think that that'll bear out in years to come. We left from Liverpool in the, yeah, it's drunk in my memory, I'm rambling on a wee bit. I took a night job manufacturing small parts for a watch company to make display stands. And when I got to 68 pounds, I could book my passage on the SS Franconia, and which I did. We left from Liverpool, we unloaded in Montreal, we came on to Port Hope by train, and in all this process, the toolbox that I'd made, they managed to drop it, lower it on the dock. They dropped it out of the net. They used to load all the luggage in boxes in the net and crane it off, and what went down. So I ended up with a broken toolbox and 50 bucks. That was my start. But on the way here on the boat, I met Muriel Hurl, and I imagine some of you know Muriel. She was coming back, and I'm trying to think, I spoke to her the other day, and I think one child was relatively young. It may even have been born in England. One was born here, and I think the one was born while she was there. She was one of those war brides, and I think she'll admit to this, that didn't know where they wanted to live. Did they want to live in Canada? Did they want to go back to England? So she did this trip several times. She was having a tough time on the boat, and I gave her a hand with these two kids. You know, because living with the family I did at home, looking to help and look after children were no problem. When we got to Port Hope, it turned out that they had a car coming to pick them up. There was enough room for me, so I came on with them. That was the 19th of October, 1951. And all of the shoulders on the roads were white with snow. And it never went away that winter. They were white until the spring. It was, you know, we talk about global warming. It's very obvious that there has been a change. I came originally to stay with Peggy and Colin Woods, and they were friends of my sister. I sort of had it in my mind that I was going to go on to Vancouver. Well, that didn't work out. I stayed with Stan and Hazel Hart for a short while. And then I moved with up to Phyllis Hamlet's mom and dad, Pop and Mom Morrison, up on Chippewa Avenue. I think it was number 15?
I don't know.
I think it was 15 Chippewa Avenue. Then I was getting into doing some work of my own and little jobs here and there, and providing I could manage to raise $15 a week, I could live, which I did virtually until the spring of '52. In the process, I realized that I was going to have a truck, and also I would.
Yeah, up here.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I spent a lot. Well, Pop Morrison's was a different house too. It had a space heater in the living room. It had a hand pump in the kitchen and an outhouse in the shed out back. And the basement during the winter months was usually 2 to 3 feet in water. And you remember, a lot of you remember the amount of water that used to come down Strickland Street. And of course that section through there to the river, the other side of town, was awash with water early in the years. It just flowed through there. And that was rectified when they dug the ditches and put drains in, so that looked after that. And due to the no shower bit, I used to end up at the YMCA, became a member, joined the Friday night club, which was a service club within the YMCA, and I have several friends still today from those years. And all in all, you know, between the people I met there and the people I've met then and since in Lakefield, it certainly has been an extremely, extremely happy life. One of the things that in 52, I got a job out the Rockhaven Motel out on the west end of Lansdowne. The one they're pulling down now, actually. They're going to build another drugstore there, I think. And that was for Denton Johnson, installing fire breaks. They were a mansard front roof, and on the back part, which was flat, we had to cut slots in them ready for the block ladders to lay the blocks up for the fire breaks. And I can remember looking at my arm, and there was a snowflake there, the size of a 50-cent piece. And I thought, Mike, what the have you done?
Easy.
Oh, gee, it was very, very, very cold. I'm not sure, but I believe that was the winter when the road from the Maples over towards Peterborough was closed down for some time, and you could actually walk across the snow, across the fence line, and touch some of the hydro lines if you wanted to. It was extremely heavy snow in winter. In the process of trying to find in the process of trying to find a vehicle, I ended up on Keith Brown's lot on Lansdowne, and I found, and I'm sure many of the men here will appreciate this. I found a 1948 Ford step-side half-ton truck. Green and black fenders. It was just a super looking vehicle. I really wish I had it today. Anyhow, it was $500, $100 down. And I said to Keith, well, I guess I'll have to come back. I haven't got $100 bucks. So I'm walking just about at the sidewalk, and he said, come back a minute. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll write up the invoice for $600 and say you put down $100, and I walked away with 100% finance truck. And
At $5.
well, it just from week to week in those days. Anyhow, I also did. Well, actually, Mr. Cherry, the druggist, gave me my first job, and it was out. He had a snack bar, just where the Remax office is today, and he, I did, what did I do there? I put a storefront on for him, because he opened a little grocery store beside it, and I also put new floors down in the snack bar for him, and new counters, if I remember rightly. And, I guess many of you who live in Lakefield remember Dr. Bailey. He lived on Burnham? On Burnham. And his family had a lumberyard up north, and I can't, Halliburton. He got into a little bit of development to sell their lumber, obviously. And I built a very small house on Clementi Street for his nurse, and I cannot remember her name. It's lost to me at the moment. Mind you, it might come back in the middle of the night sometime, but when many things do. And then I built a house, and it's still there today, 95 Reed Street.
Again for Dr. Bailey.
And again, this was for Dr. Bailey. I think the Beauclairs lived there for a while. I'm not sure. And this is where some of the funny little twerky things come in. Across the street, Bill.
We talk.
Thank you. I think of it. Bill and Marjorie. And I'm working away happily at the house, and all of a sudden, here's mother script. This is why you need a lapel phone. The lapel mic, sorry. Mrs. Wheattime came barreling across the road and, I'm in all sorts of trouble. And her daughter had managed to get ahead through the railings on the stairs and couldn't get it out. She was stuck head first, looking down into the hall. And funnily enough, when May was here, I went up to her and said, I can remember. And she continued when I got my head stuck. So she has an extremely good memory. So I went over and got that sorted out. Took out a couple of paintings the way she went. None the worse for wear. I used to work weekends down at Davis Boat Livery, which is there now, still there. And Aileen's going to pick this up because this is where it gets a little personal.
Oh. No. No, this is actually Aileen meets Mike. When I was growing up in Peterborough, I know when Mike's mother found out Mike wasn't going to be sending money for his girl he was engaged to in England, he said, well, what is this girl? What is this attraction? And I said to Mike, for goodness sakes, don't tell her that her dad came from Belfast and she was born in Quebec, or your mother will never forgive you. But anyway, the boys used to come out to Lakefield because the Lakefield girls, for some reason, had some strong attraction. We never could figure it out. So a bunch of us that had been all together at PCBS, we were always losing our guys on Friday night to those girls in Lakefield. So after I graduated from school, and I went to work at Canada Packers, a girl there was older than me, and I couldn't really remember how I got to Lakefield, but it must have been that Betty Pritchard, who I was with, she must have driven a car. I know she and I did hitchhike to Chemong once, but that was before. So we stopped in at Davy's Boat Livery to get a chocolate bar. And the big new thing was water skiing. And I was with a group on Chemong Lake because my boyfriend all through high school had been Trevor Mitchell, whose parents owned a place on Chemong. And we were forming a water ski club, which was just so radical. It was never going to work. Everybody said it'll never work. But we were watching it down where it was in the States, where they had it in, not Sun Valley, but, on TV. So I go in and to get a chocolate bar, and here's this guy, and he's bent over this strange-looking arrangement, and he's, for goodness sakes, he's making water skis. And we thought, well, how the dickens is he doing that? So he looked up at me and said, could you put your foot down here, because I don't know where to put the toe thing and where to put the heel thing. So I said, sure. So I put my foot down, and boy, did I ever not realize what I was doing. And then left. And our group was forming our club at the YMCA. Well, the YMCA in there is every well-brought-up girl. You never set foot inside the YMCA because the boys swam without bathing suits. And we envisioned all these naked boys running around the YMCA. So the night that I lived up on 3rd Avenue in Peterborough, where they built the water tower while we were there, and I'd taken a bus, and I'd only ran every half hour, so I got there too early. Well, I'm very nervously by myself, standing outside the door of the Boys' Y, waiting for somebody to come along that I could go in with. And I look, and here is Mike sitting in this 1948 jazzy-looking truck, and he recognized me. And he said, "Oh, you're really early. We're both really early. Do you want to sit in my truck?" Wow. He was a man. He was 6 years older than me. He was a man, and I never even gave it a thought. I said, "Sure." So,
in all honesty, I always say that I had a foot fetish.
yeah. That must have been it. That must have been it. I always keep my toenails painted red. So I sat in the truck, and then we just chatted about water skiing or something, and we went into the meeting. So after the meeting, I think for some reason Mike felt a little obligated, because I had told him I'd come on a bus and it was too early. So I think Mike felt a little obligated to drive this little girl home. So he drove me home, and my mother said, "You're home at a strange time because the bus only came every half hour and I was in between the bus times." And I said, "Oh, this man gave me a ride," and I told her about the chocolate bar and the water skis. And I said, "I think he's English." I didn't know any British people. I'd never heard any British people speak. And my mother, who was so quiet, said, "You have to watch those British boys. I think they're pretty fast workers." And I went, "Mom, he's a man. He's way older than me, and I didn't understand a word he said." So what Mike was saying was that he had this very serious life of having to have $15 every Monday morning for his board. And so he would have no time to call me to go to a movie. And I went, "Well, who cares?" So Wednesday night when the phone rang, "Would you like to go to a movie?" I went, "Aren't you too busy?" Anyway, I went to a movie. We sat that night till 2 o'clock in the morning talking. And 3 weeks later, Mike said, "You know, I think we'll eventually get married." I was 17. Anyway, the rest is history. We went through one winter of Mike commuting at the end of about his 10 or 11 hour day of hammering nails. He would commute to Peterborough in the winter, and then we would sit on the couch until my parents went to bed and then talk for 2 more hours, and then Mike would go home feeling the mailboxes to find his way home in the snow. So the next summer we had a lot of fun. We water skied, we did all kinds of great things. And the winter was coming, and Mike said, "Excuse me, but you said, like, we did agree to get married, didn't we? And do I have to go through another one of those winters?" My father wasn't getting too happy about these 2-hour conversations on the Chesterfield at midnight either. He kept checking us. And Mike said, "What are we waiting for?" And I said, "I think we're waiting for me to get older." And so I was the baby in the family. But one night we sat there. Mike said, "I'm going to speak to your father tonight." And I said, "Okay." Well, my father liked, who was the music guy? Lawrence Welk. So we sat through an hour of Lawrence Welk, with Mike going in the commercials, "Mr. Todd, oh, sorry, the Lawrence Welk is back on." So we sat there to the 11 o'clock news. And then finally, Mike said, "Mr. Todd, I want to marry your daughter." And my mother said, "Oh my goodness, she's so young." I said, "We'll wait 2 years." But we knew we wouldn't. And so that was probably in, I think we were engaged in June, and we were married that December. And that December, Mike decided the previous winter also, he had driven to Vancouver, towing about, do you remember the length of the house trailer? It was maybe 28 feet long. In order to get the McGinnis Trailers in Peterborough, paid you to deliver trailers. And many people had trips paid for by McGinnis Trailers. Well, we didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, so for our honeymoon, Mike said, we're driving a trailer to Vancouver. And I said, okay, I just want to go to Niagara Falls. And he said, well, never mind, it'll be fun. Well, you know, we did, 28 was nothing. We were going to take it was either 34 or 36. All I know is it had a living room, a kitchen, a dining room, and a bedroom. And we could sleep in it, but we couldn't cook in it. So we had some fun. Nothing went wrong. All we had, I don't even know how much, we had very little money, only probably enough for gas and a little bit of food. We had to deliver this trailer in Lethbridge, Alberta. And I had a little typewriter in a little case on my lap, and I typed endless letters to my mother, you know, which none of them got to her till after we got home, because remember the Christmas mail used to be 2 and 3 weeks? She didn't know if I was dead or alive. And 40 miles an hour across the prairies, I certainly got to know the prairies. Got to love those big blue, endless skies. You'd see a black dot in the distance, and about half an hour later, a truck would go by. And then you'd watch for the next one. We dropped the trailer in Lethbridge. They told us we had to take it 100 miles north, and we said, give us our check, we're done. So we carried on then through the mountains to Vancouver, not knowing that at that time it's the end of December and they're closing the passes behind us. Rabbit ears, you know. So we carried on to Vancouver, where we had about 2.5 weeks of rain. Mike's sister lived right in, they had come after Mike, and she and her husband and 2 children were living in a tiny little dollhouse right in the city, right between the 2 canyons. It rained